Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season, on average in a half PPR scoring format between weeks 8 through 14, in order to give ourselves some more context in regards to who has the most advantageous matchups going into Week 15. And if you've made it this far, again, congratulations. This is the first week of the fantasy football playoffs, and it's taken a lot of strategy, some key decision making, of course, whether it was during your draft and or your starts and sits throughout the week, and of course a lot of luck to get this far, but congratulations nonetheless. Let's go ahead and continue the success and capture a 2021 fantasy football championship, because that is the entire goal of the season. After we talk about the matchups, of course, we'll then transition to our top 36 running back rankings, as I'll share with you guys my thought process and opinions and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to how I think it's all going to be kind of stacked up when it's all said and done at the end of Week 15 and we're winning our Week 15 matchups. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys for, of course, supporting the channel. If you guys have not yet already subscribed, we are very close to surpassing 58,000 subscribers. Of course, our goal before the end of the season is 60K. So if you can help us get there, and of course, you've been helped by my content throughout the year, of course, be sure to subscribe. I really do appreciate it. Outside of that, of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are trying to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, if in fact your season is done, or perhaps you're sitting on a bye week, you're the first and second seed of your respective league, and you still want to play fantasy this week and you've got nothing to do, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. If you go ahead and do so and sign up using promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. You can go ahead and play in the Thursday night contest, the Sunday contest. There are a variety of games that you can play and, of course, win some money. Last night, I did participate in the Monday night brawl between the Los Angeles Rams and Arizona Cardinals, and I had drafted myself 3 teams. I'll go ahead and throw up on screen. I drafted 3 teams. I had the first pick and the second pick twice. So obviously, my shares consisted of a lot of James Conner, because I did anticipate him, with Chase Edmonds being out and confirmed out last night, to have himself a great performance. If I had just done one difference, if I had taken AJ Green in the very first draft there as my final pick instead of Rondale Moore, I don't even remember if he was available, but if he was and I messed up that badly to not get him, man, it could have been a world of difference. But each potential entry was $5. Was able to double my money either way. A lot of fun to be had there. Besides the fact that I'm watching a game in which I'm rooting for my Los Angeles Rams, I'm able to at least have some players that I'm rooting for even on the other team. Nonetheless, a lot of fun to be had there. Check that out. There's a link down in the description. All right, now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and transition and begin talking about the running back position via matchups in Week 15. As you can see on screen, we have weeks 8 through 14 running back fantasy points allowed from respective defenses. As you can see on screen to the very left, the New York Jets, Las Vegas Raiders, Pittsburgh Steelers, they are giving up the most points to opposing running backs on a per weekly basis on average in the last 6 to 7 games of the season for each team respectively. Some of them have had bye weeks throughout that time, some haven't. But either way, it's all been calculated properly. As you can see, they're giving up over 28 points per game to opposing running backs. Obviously, we saw Dalvin Cook have an incredible game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Las Vegas Raiders, they got completely showered on by 3 different running backs who all scored, whether it was Clyde Edwards, Darrell Williams, or Derek Gore. The New York Jets, of course, every single week, they give up a lot of points. Alvin Kamara had himself a successful game, not to mention Taysom Hill on the ground find himself a lot of success. He's not a running back, but he was certainly running the ball like he was one. Either way, they give up the most points on a weekly basis to opposing running backs. Now, to the right of that, we have weeks 8 through 14 running back rushing stats allowed based on how many points are given up via the ground, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns to opposing teams. As you can see, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Houston Texans, Detroit Lions, they're giving up the most points in that specific category. Now that we've kind of given you some context as to who is giving up the most points on the other end of the spectrum, of course, we see the Miami Dolphins, Baltimore Ravens, Philadelphia Eagles. These are teams that continue to repeat on both sides of these statistics because they have not given up very many points to opposing running backs. In fact, the Baltimore Ravens and Miami Dolphins in the last, 6 to 7 weeks here have given up 0 touchdowns each to opposing running backs, whether it is on the ground or through the air. An incredible statistic, and that is why they have been so good and have been one of the tougher matchups at the position. Now that we've kind of gone over this, I want to go ahead and transition and give you more context via stats at the matchup position and give you guys a full breakdown as to the stats that have been allowed. Like I just mentioned, the Baltimore Ravens and Miami Dolphins, they've given up 0 touchdowns to opposing running backs over the last 6 to 7 games. I know the Miami Dolphins just had a bye week, and of course, the Baltimore Ravens had a bye week earlier, but each of them have played 6 games since week 8. Nonetheless, all in all, these are the stats. Of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers have given up 12 touchdowns in the last couple of games that they have played. The New York Jets, they've given up 12 as well. The Las Vegas Raiders, of course, another one of these teams that is almost at that double-digit range in terms of giving up touchdowns. This last week, they gave up nearly half of those. Either way, a lot of points to be had via some of these great matchups, and we will refer back to these as we progress through the video, but I wanted to show you guys these statistics so you can use them to your best ability to make the most educated decisions on a weekly basis. All right, now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and transition to our top 36 running back rankings. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We always mention it on every video, especially considering these things. This video specifically comes out on a Tuesday. There's a lot of things that are going to change between now and Thursday and now and Sunday morning, so be sure to stay up to date with my latest content. Of course, everything's going to change via Patreon. Again, there's rankings that I post on a weekly basis to help you guys get everything settled. I answer all questions via Patreon. If you guys are interested, check that out. It's down in the description. Outside of that, do not forget there are no teams on bye, and there are 2 Saturday games this week. So we will be having a stream on Saturday morning and Sunday morning. Just wanted to mention that. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Beginning with our top 36 rankings, our top 12 guys that we are obviously starting, but I will give some context to why they have been so great as of late. Beginning with the king at the running back position, Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor's coming off of a bye week. Obviously, he's going to be fresh and healthy, taking on the New England Patriots. But regardless of the matchup, he is the number 1 running back in fantasy for a reason, and we respect it with all of our potential ability that we can. Since week 4, he's been averaging 26.23 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Jonathan Taylor has just been unstoppable in the last 10 games. And the reason why I wanted to mention since week 4 is because, weeks 1 through 3, he was just an average running back. He had scored 0 touchdowns in the first 3 games of the season, but since then, from weeks 4 through 13, had scored 18 total touchdowns in the last 10 games. There's a reason why he has been so fantastic. He's found an end zone every single game on a consecutive 10-game streak. That is what makes him a special running back. On top of that, this week, you may be concerned about the New England Patriots matchup, but in fact, since week 8, the New England Patriots are giving up the most yards per carry to opposing running backs, 5.34 yards per carry. It's going to be an advantageous matchup for Jonathan Taylor. I think he's going to be an unstoppable force once again. Moving on to Dalvin Cook, our number 2, taking on the Chicago Bears, another one of these stud running backs. Despite the fact that he was dealing with a shoulder injury, came in and absolutely dominated last Thursday night. There's a reason why I had Alexander Mattison as a top 3 running back last week in my rankings, because I knew the Pittsburgh Steelers were not a great matchup. And there's a reason why Dalvin Cook could just insert himself into the lineup and go for 205 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 34.7 fantasy points. That kind of production, unexpected to say the very least, but we will take it. Either way, Dalvin Cook, he takes on the Chicago Bears this week. He's had himself great success against that organization over the years. And as being a running back that is getting the amount of opportunities he has been given, anytime Dalvin Cook has the opportunity to touch the ball 20 to 25 times a game, maybe even more, of course, we're anticipating 20 plus fantasy points, and that's what we've considerably seen all season long, and that's what we anticipate this upcoming week against the Chicago Bears. Moving on, Austin Ekeler's our number 3. Again, Coach Brandon Staley said that he's potentially going to play, and he's expecting him to do so. And if that's going to be the case, then by all means, he is starting in my lineup. Coming off of a week in which he played, pretty much only 3/4 of that game, had himself still 15.4 fantasy points. I wanted to go ahead and mention the matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. Though the Chiefs have played extremely well as of late, Austin Ekeler has been able to dismantle that defense every single opportunity that he's had against them since 2018. In the last 6 games, these are his total fantasy point contributions against that defense. 19.7, 16.8, 14.1, 17.2, 13.4, 21.1. Again, at 17.05 fantasy points per game on average in the last 6 contests against the Kansas City Chiefs. Of course, that's with Melvin Gordon in the backfield some of those years. That's without him. I think Austin Ekeler, of course, as long as he's healthy and he's ready to go, he's in our lineups. There's a reason why he's the number 2 overall running back in fantasy right now. He continues to be a stud. Moving on to Alvin Kamara, again, coming off of a great week against the New York Jets. It was a great way to kind of get him involved in the offense in an easier matchup and get him ready for this upcoming week's matchup against Tampa Bay, which of course we all know is very difficult. But nonetheless, Alvin Kamara, 27 carries, 120 yards, even with Taysom Hill in the backfield, got himself 4 catches for 25 yards. That is incredible. As long as he is getting the primary opportunity on the ground and getting a couple touches through the air, because of course we know Taysom Hill's still dealing with a little bit of a finger injury and he's going to have to get the ball out of his hands quicker than we anticipate. I think this continues to lead to potential success for Alvin Kamara. Since 2019, in the last 5 games that he's played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he himself has found considerable success. I mean, averaging 16.16 fantasy points per game against them. The last couple performances, 15.1, 21.2, 13.4, 13.92, and 17.2. Always putting up double-digit performances, and that is why he maintains in our lineup against Tampa Bay. Moving on, we have Nick Chubb as our number 5. I mean, again, Nick Chubb is a stud running back, and though he has had himself some struggles over the last 2 weeks, it has to do with the fact that the matchups weren't great. And of course, that is just it. The Baltimore Ravens haven't given up a single touchdown to opposing running backs since week 8. So why do we anticipate that Nick Chubb was going to be the difference maker? Well, we thought, of course, this Kevin Stefanski-led offense, with how good their offensive line has been all season long, would be able to turn it around. Unfortunately, was not the case. Nonetheless, they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. They are giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs, and that hasn't always been the case. But just this last week, my goodness, it was an unbelievable showering of points from Kansas City running backs. The Kansas City football team, from their 3 respective running backs, combined for 21 carries, 111 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 8 targets, 8 catches, 59 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, and 45 fantasy points as a trio. Not only that, Antonio Gibson recently, 19.6 points against that defense, and Joe Mixon, 24.3 points. The Las Vegas defense, they are in trouble. They're certainly giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs. And with Kareem Hunt hurt with an ankle injury, and Kevin Stefanski, the head coach of the Cleveland Browns, saying he is most likely not going to play this week, Nick Chubb is a fantastic start and a stud running back play this week. And that is why he is our thumbnail. Moving on to James Conner. Now, I understand that he unfortunately sustained an injury at the end of the game. But despite all the speculation that we're going to have within the coming days, it is going to be a matter of whether or not he practices this week. I mean, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday practice, those are going to be vital to understanding what exactly his current scenario is and what his timeline is if, in fact, the injury is going to hold him out for a given amount of time. But if it's not going to, I want to mention James Conner, of course, as a top 6 running back, because that is purely what he is, coming off of a 29-point fantasy performance in which he had 2 touchdowns, had himself 9 catches on 9 targets for 94 yards last night. Unbelievable amount of points. He has just been unstoppable without Chase Edmonds in this backfield, and he has proven that week over week. Now, of course, he takes on the Detroit Lions, and if he has the privilege of playing them, my goodness, they've given up 10 total touchdowns in the last 6 weeks. Not only did the Denver Broncos demolish them, but the 2 running backs, Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon, combined for 43.9 fantasy points against that defense. Since week 3, in the last 11 games, James Conner has scored 16 total touchdowns, and he's been averaging 18.09 fantasy points per game. He is an unstoppable force, and if he is ready for the Detroit Lions, I can assure you they're not ready for him. Moving on to Leonard Fournette, our number 7. Again, Leonard Fournette has been just unstoppable. I mean, out of all the running backs in the National Football League, I thought about this today as I was kind of putting together stats. He really does seem like he's going to be like the fantasy MVP. He may win people championships this year based on what he has been doing and what he'll continue to do as Lombardi Lenny has been taking over. I mean, coming off of a 21-point fantasy week against the Buffalo Bills, we knew the Buffalo Bills could not stop the run. And of course, Leonard Fournette obviously showed that. Went on a huge run for a touchdown, got himself involved in the passing game, and that is where he separates himself. Besides the fact that he's been able to score a touchdown in 3 consecutive weeks, has been able to surpass 100 rushing yards in 2 out of the last 3 games, and has gotten himself 32 receptions in the last 5 games, he currently leads the running back position in total receptions, 62. The next highest is 60 behind him, which is Najee Harris, and an Austin Ekeler behind that. With Giovanni Bernard out for the foreseeable future, Leonard Fournette, regardless of matchup, even against the New Orleans Saints, finds himself more and more value every single week. He's unstoppable, and that is why we continue to play him. Moving on to Najee Harris, like I just mentioned, in regards to total receptions this season, Najee Harris is number 2 amongst all running backs with 60 total receptions. Obviously, that 1 week in which he had, 14 catches at the running back position certainly helped skew his numbers in a direction. But nonetheless, he takes on the Tennessee Titans. He's coming off of a 23.9 fantasy point game in which he pretty much scored all of those points in the second half against the Minnesota Vikings defense that pretty much took their foot off the pedal. They didn't really want to, play much defense in that second half, but we'll take it. For those of us who are Najee Harris managers, we will obviously enjoy the fact that we were able to get ourselves 20-plus fantasy points out of him once again. The Tennessee Titans, yes, they are a tougher matchup, but As of the last 3 weeks, they have played the Houston Texans and the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that has relatively skewed the numbers in the direction of making the Tennessee Titans look like a team that you cannot run the ball on. I don't think that is the case. I think there can be certain success that we'll find. The New England Patriots, New Orleans Saints, Los Angeles Rams, and Indianapolis Colts all had their starting running back score a touchdown against that defense when they played against them in the last 6 weeks. There's a lot of potential to be had here, and I absolutely think a running back who is currently averaging 23 touches per game is obviously going to be a workhorse on a given week and be a great fantasy play. Moving on to Joe Mixon. Speaking of a workhorse, I mean, my goodness, he has just been unstoppable. Though his touchdowns haven't been there in terms of getting consistent touches, despite the fact that he was sick all week long, he was still able to get himself 20 plus touches. The week prior, even though in the last 2 games, 9.4 and 7.8 fantasy points the week prior, got himself 20 plus fantasy touches. As long as this man is touching the ball, the touchdowns are going to get there. He went on a streak in which he was scoring 2 touchdowns in 4 consecutive games. So I'll give him the break now that he's had a couple games off from getting into the end zone. But now it's time to get back into the end zone and get our teams to the next round of the fantasy playoffs. I think Joe Mixon, despite the fact that, of course, he's been dealing with some health concerns and all that kind of stuff, he will get back on track this week. Samaje Perine isn't a threat in any regard, in my opinion, and I think the Bengals are ready to get back on track. Of course, lost a couple games the last couple weeks that have certainly hurt their playoff chances. They got to put the pedal to the metal and get Joe Mixon back into the end zone and get back to running the ball. Moving on to Cordarrelle Patterson, our number 10. This week, it is the battle of the hybrid running back / wide receivers. Deebo Samuel will be taking on Cordarrelle Patterson, as Cordarrelle Patterson will be traveling to take on the San Francisco 49ers. Again, this is going to be a very interesting game, but here's the thing about Cordarrelle Patterson. Besides the fact that, of course, in the last 3 games, he has gotten 15 rushing attempts minimum in each of those games. He's in a situation where he's getting a great yard per carry average, he is scoring touchdowns, and he's getting relatively involved in the receiving game. As of late, of course, specifically this last week's game against the Carolina Panthers, he was pulled out in the 4th quarter, and they just let Mike Davis handle the rest of the work. They're pretty much resting him because they know he's getting a lot of touches. His body hasn't been used to this many touches in quite some time. Really, I don't even know when the last time he got this many touches in his NFL career. Maybe it hasn't been since college that he's touched the ball this much in a season. But either way, the only concern about Cordarrelle Patterson at times is Mike Davis going to, vulture a touchdown? Is Mike Davis going to continue on his streak of getting 3 to 5 receptions per game? If those are going to continue, it will hurt Cordarrelle Patterson. But is it going to make him an unstartable prospect? Absolutely not. Cordarrelle Patterson continues to find himself 10 plus fantasy points every single week, and we expect that this week against San Francisco, giving up the 10th most points to opposing running backs. Moving on to David Montgomery, our number 11. Listen, David Montgomery, 11.1 fantasy points, quite disappointing to say the very least. Just wanted to go ahead and mention, they do take on the Minnesota Vikings. Elijah Mitchell recently went for 133 and a touchdown, 5 catches for 35 against that defense, while Najee Harris went for 94 yards and a touchdown, 3 catches, 10 yards, and a touchdown. Both of them with 20-plus points against that defense. If rookie running backs can go ahead and post those numbers, I think David Montgomery and an offense that wants to go ahead and run the ball consistently will get into a scenario in which they're dominating that Minnesota defense. I mean, the last 2 times that we've seen David Montgomery take on the Minnesota Vikings in his career, he put up 28.7 points and 17.3 points in a half PPR scoring format. And though this last week, the game script really was not on their side, a lot of the points that they got in the first half were via special teams and or a couple big plays from their wide receiver positions. But in the second half, of course, had to kind of crawl back into the game, was able to get himself 7 targets, 6 catches, 39 yards, ran the 4th most routes amongst all wide receivers in week 14, which is certainly a promising sign. And hopefully, as we progress, we'll get more opportunity on the ground, find himself a touchdown there, and put together a great 18-plus point fantasy performance, which we're hoping to see. Moving on to number 12, we have Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones takes on the Baltimore Ravens, and though they have not given up a single touchdown in the last 6 games that they have played, we have to go ahead and just throw it out on the table. Aaron Jones is different. The Green Bay Packers offense will give him the ball, and they'll know that he's going to find the end zone. He had 8 touches on Sunday. 8 literal touches, and he scored 2 touchdowns and 20 fantasy points. His fantasy points per touch average is just wild at that point. And obviously, that kind of consistency isn't going to exist, especially against a team like the Baltimore Ravens. But if we're going to be in scenarios in which A.J. Dillon is going to, run the rock for the entirety of the first drive in the second half, get him down to the red zone, and then Aaron Jones is going to come in and steal touchdowns on a consecutive basis, then by all means, he's going to be in my lineup because we know that this team trusts him down in the red zone, and he's going to continue to be that starting running back despite however many touches they expose him to. Moving on to number 13, we have Elijah Mitchell of the San Francisco 49ers. Again, another must start if he is available to play. I know he didn't play this last week, but we are certainly missing his contribution. The last 3 games that we have seen him play, 27, 32, and 25 total touches. When you're in that category, that is of the level of a Dalvin Cook, of a Najee Harris. I mean, these are running backs that are getting unbelievable touches and delivering on it. The only reason we have Elijah Mitchell at number 13 in comparison to anywhere higher, despite the fact that he's taken on the Atlanta Falcons, one of the easier matchups at the running back position, giving up the 8th most points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis as of late, is because of Deebo Samuel being the RB2, maybe even RB1 of this team at times. I mean, again, Deebo Samuel, for another consecutive week while active, rushes for a touchdown. I mean, that's 4 rushing touchdowns as of late. Deebo Samuel is dominating on the ground, getting a lot of work at the backfield, and not even catching the ball any longer. Yes, he's running routes, but really it's becoming the Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle game via the receiving work. And with Deebo Samuel continuing to find more and more success on the ground, of course, it will siphon some value away from Elijah Mitchell. But nonetheless, he's a stud running back, should be able to put up an incredible amount of points, and is a must start. Moving on to number 14, Javonte Williams, another rookie running back that I wanted to mention. Javonte Williams coming off of a 20-point fantasy week. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, Andrew, why is Javonte Williams at number 14, even though Melvin Gordon out-touched him 24-16 on Sunday against the Detroit Lions? I'll go ahead and explain it. Though Melvin Gordon played 50% of the snaps and Javonte Williams played 49% of the snaps, Javonte Williams is by far and away the pass catching back of this team. The amount of routes that he ran in comparison to Melvin Gordon this last week was an unbelievable margin. I mean, literally Melvin Gordon ran 1 route and the other 17 routes at the running back position were ran by Javonte Williams. And you're not going to always have contests where you're winning, 28-7 at halftime. You're not going to always have that, especially when you take on the Cincinnati Bengals this week. So, of course, they're not going to be able to run the ball as much, which will, of course, force the offense to get into a game script in which they're throwing. And when you're, in fact, throwing the ball, you're going to have to go ahead and check it down to Javonte Williams. We certainly know that Melvin Gordon is a capable receiving back, but nonetheless, I think Javonte Williams will pick up that work, and that is why we have him at number 14. I think this offense, especially with the return of Garrett Bowles at the left tackle position and Bobby Massey, one of the better run blockers at the right tackle position, they have been dominating in the last 2 consecutive weeks, which is why the running back position has really taken a step forward in the last 2 games for this team. I think Javonte Williams an automatic play against Cincinnati this week. Moving on to Josh Jacobs, though he had himself a very early fumble that pretty much landslided that game into a very bad direction, it turned the game script into a point where Josh Jacobs could not be utilized. I mean, literally, this is the exact same thing that happened the last time they played against the Kansas City Chiefs, where he was completely game scripted out of the contest. But despite that, he has at least gotten himself a lot of work in the receiving game, was able to at least recover his unfortunate week. 5 catches on 6 targets, 46 yards. Without Kenyon Drake in the lineup, he has had 15 targets, 14 receptions, and 84 receiving yards in the last 2 weeks. There's a lot of success to be had with Josh Jacobs, and I think going forward, it's only going to get better. Let's not forget, he was coming off of back-to-back weeks of 16-plus fantasy points at the running back position, finding a touchdown. I think he'll be able to do so once again against Cleveland this week. Moving on to Antonio Gibson, another running back that the game script really just did get away from them. Unfortunately, despite the fact that Antonio Gibson, really did have himself a great opportunity to score fantasy points, he fumbled early, similar to a Josh Jacobs, and the game script got away from them because the Dallas Cowboys scored a consecutive, 18 points until, I think it was 21 points until the Washington football team was able to have some sort of rebuttal at that point. Either way, Antonio Gibson only had 10 total rushing attempts for 36 yards, only 2 catches, despite J.D. McKissic's absence, of course, with a concussion for a second consecutive week. And Taylor Heineke didn't help either. 11 for 25 passing. Terry McLaurin went down with an injury. It was all bad and really just got away from them. They were able to crawl back into that game, but nothing really was able to reestablish much. That being said, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, it is the 3rd toughest matchup at the position, but I do think Antonio Gibson is the key to this offense, and if they want to run the ball, they can certainly do it against anybody in the National Football League, and I think he'll find success this week. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott, our number 17. Ezekiel Elliott from weeks 1 through 6 was averaging 17.76 fantasy points per game. From weeks 8 through 14, he's been averaging 11.08 fantasy points per game. He comes off of another consecutive week of less than 51 rushing yards. I think that's the 6th time in a row that he has been able to accomplish that, and it's not really an accomplishment. In fact, it's something lesser than that, but it is Zeke nonetheless, and we do put respect on his name, but you have to just put it into account. as of late, he has not been the greatest running back. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, he's finished as the number 28 overall running back and the number 37 overall running back. If he's not able to get himself receptions, which he only had 1 on 6 targets this last week, and not able to find the end zone, didn't score a touchdown, of course, 8.5 fantasy points seems like a normal number. And with the potential of Tony Pollard coming back, that is why we have him at number 17. That being said, again, we do put respect on Ezekiel Elliott's name. And though I could have potentially put him back at number 22 like I had him last week, I'm going to leave him at 17 because his track record against the New York Giants is fantastic. In the last 6 games that he's played against them, he has scored 7 touchdowns and he's averaged 17.45 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Zeke, hopefully you have the New York Giants number. You won't have Tyron Smith, which will certainly make it more difficult. We'll just have to wait and see if you can find the end zone. Moving on to Saquon Barkley. Speaking of the matchup against the New York Giants, Saquon Barkley is coming off of a 17-point fantasy performance, but I don't want you to be fooled. Saquon Barkley literally scored with seconds left on the clock, with literally like 70 seconds left. And if he wasn't able to catch that ball wide open, might I add, in the back of the end zone, we have ourselves a pretty underwhelming performance of less than 10 fantasy points. But nonetheless, my biggest concern, besides the fact was that, with that late touchdown, is Devontae Booker. This last week, Devontae Booker played just as many snaps, I think about 45%, while Saquon Barkley played about 50% of the snaps. But yes, it was a blowout. So perhaps the fact that it was a blowout led to Devontae Booker getting touches. But the fact that Devontae Booker is coming out with 10 plus fantasy points because he's stealing receptions, vulturing work on the ground, getting 10 plus touches on the ground, with that being a consistent thing, it could lead to, of course, Saquon Barkley being less and less effective as an overall play, because if the opportunity is being siphoned, then of course his upside is going to continue to decrease. Nonetheless, we don't know if it's even Daniel Jones starting this week. If Mike Glennon is the starter, I think I'm pretty confident in, of course, putting Saquon at number 18, because Mike Glennon certainly loves to target running backs and will continue to give value to Saquon in that factor. But either way, we got to be careful with Saquon. The offense is a little underwhelming. They're getting blown out in consecutive games here, and he's going to have to get a lot of garbage time points if he wants to survive. Moving on to our number 19, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire of the Kansas City Chiefs taking on the 4th easiest matchup at the position against the Los Angeles Chargers on Thursday Night Football in SoFi Stadium. I've considered going to that game, but I don't know if I'll be able to. Either way, the last time he took on the Los Angeles Chargers, he ran for 100 rushing yards, got himself a receiving touchdown, and was a great fantasy point contributor. But the conversation now kind of pivots to not what he did in the past, but what we're going to expect this week, because there is a little bit of a concern. Darrell Williams is getting himself into positions to be a threat to Clyde Edwards' total overall fantasy contributions. Last week, of course, against the Las Vegas Raiders, in which it was a blowout, Clyde Edwards found himself 2 touchdowns. 10 rushes, 37 yards. Not very efficient. 3 catches on 3 targets, 5 receiving yards, 17.7 fantasy points. Without those touchdowns, of course, nothing really does, really happens for Clyde Edwards. But luckily, the offense is potent enough to get in the end zone. My biggest concern is Darrell Williams, because not only did he have himself a receiving touchdown, he had himself a rushing attempt from the 4-yard line, literally right after Clyde Edwards had himself in the game. They take out Clyde Edwards, they bring in Darrell Williams into the game, and he goes ahead and runs the ball, is 1 yard short of a touchdown. And then, of course, the next play becomes a Josh Gordon receiving touchdown. But if, in fact, opportunities are going to go around and everyone's going to prosper from this, then by all means, we're good to go. But if we're getting into a scenario in which Darrell Williams, maybe even Derek Gore, is going to potentially take away touches and vital touchdowns from Clyde Edwards, we could be in a little bit of trouble. Hopefully, it's not going to be the case, and Clyde Edwards continues to be the main goal line back for this team. Moving on to Sony Michel, our number 20. Again, Sony Michel is pretty much filling in perfectly for Darrell Henderson, but the only issue is if he's not able to find an overall touchdown, his receiving work is not going to exist. And that is what has been the case for the last 2 weeks here, and we've seen that. In the last 2 weeks, he's had 44 rushing attempts for 200 rushing yards and a touchdown, and that's where his value predominantly lies. And until we're going to see something else out of this backfield, if Darrell Henderson is going to return, I think Sony Michel continues to be a top 20 play, specifically because they play against the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, even the last time that Sony Michel took on the Seattle Seahawks, Thursday Night Football, Week 5, Russell Wilson busted his finger that game. Sony Michel had an entire drive dedicated to himself in that second quarter where he just ran the ball 10 times consecutively, was able to get himself a great amount of yardage, and not only that, was able to score himself a touchdown in that contest. I think there's a lot of value to be had, specifically, of course, because the Seattle Seahawks, they've given up the 9th most points to opposing running backs since Week 8, and that's going to continue to be a vital point of where the Los Angeles Rams are going to target them, continue to run the ball on them, and find success in that regard. Moving on to number 21, Devonta Foreman. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers matchup, like I mentioned, it's the second easiest one amongst all teams in the National Football League. And when we're talking about giving up the most rushing stats to opposing running backs, rushing touchdowns and rushing yards, I mean, by all means, they've given up the most points since week 8. In fact, the record that we saw on Thursday was that Dalvin Cook had the most rushing yards this season in the first half amongst all running backs. He had beaten Joe Mixon's record. And both of those players had accomplished those stats against the Pittsburgh Steelers in the first half. There's a lot of potential to be had here, and I don't think the Pittsburgh Steelers can go, with a TJ Watt injury and turn it around and become a great defense all of a sudden. That's not going to be the case. They're going to continue to hemorrhage as they cannot stop the run. In fact, they've allowed 131 rushing yards, 1.7 rushing touchdowns, and 28.69 fantasy points per game in the last 7 games. That kind of average is unbelievable, and as long as Foreman continues to be the lead back for this team and continues to find himself in the end zone, touching the ball more than Jeremy McNichols and Hilliard combined, Devonta Foreman is a must-play at the position this week for the run-first Tennessee Titans. Moving on to Melvin Gordon. You may have been wondering, where is Melvin Gordon in comparison to Javonte Williams? Well, I think that Melvin Gordon, yes, he looked incredible. Despite the fact he was coming off of a missing week in which he had a hip injury, he still got himself a great amount of touches, 24 touches. Came out and on the first play of the game for the Denver Broncos offense, looked like he was shot out of a cannon. He was so fast. He looked revitalized, and that is extremely promising. 24 carries for 111 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. The fact that he looked fresh and he got himself 23 fantasy points and how well he's played all season long gives me promise that I have to start him. And that is why he sits here. But my only concern is if, in fact, we get into a scenario in which, of course, he goes back to not scoring touchdowns like he has in weeks past. I mean, look at the 2 prior performances, less than 10 fantasy points and a half PPR for a reason. If we're in a scenario where the Cincinnati Bengals aren't giving up much on the ground like they did this last week against the San Francisco 49ers, who are just as capable of a running team, then Melvin Gordon is going to be in trouble if Javonte Williams is taking all the receiving work. But I'm hoping both these men can find equal opportunity and both find equal success in both three incredible plays this week at the running back position. Moving on to Devonta Freeman, another one of these veteran running backs taking on the Green Bay Packers. It is a tougher matchup. Now, regardless of who's going to be playing at the quarterback position, I still think that Devonta Freeman will find success because in 3 out of the last 4 weeks, this man has gotten himself 5 or more receptions. The fact that he continues to coat his baseline of production, his floor, with this many receptions, in a full PPR, that is outrageous numbers. In a half PPR, we will take it, and it continues to get him to that 9 to 10 point range every single week. Unfortunately, this week, Devonta Freeman could not find the end zone, but he was able to do so in 5 out of the last 7 games he had played prior to this week. But this week, Rashad Bateman gets himself a nice 30-yard grab, goes down to the 1-yard line, and then all of a sudden, we see Latavius Murray coming onto the field. Runs in a 1-yard attempt, literally had 1 attempt all day for a 1-yard rushing touchdown. An absolute vulture. Latavius Murray, you did screw over Devonta Freeman. We forgive you for that, but either way, Freeman is going to be a great play regardless of who's at the quarterback position this week against Green Bay. Moving on to Rashaad Penny, our number 24. He is going to be the number 1 waiver wire pickup for this week, and by all means, you should be going after him because he could certainly be a starter for your team. The thing that I wanted to mention, besides the fact that he plays against the Los Angeles Rams, though James Conner went for 29 total fantasy points, he still wasn't that efficient on the ground. James Conner was able to put together 13 carries for 31 yards. 2 rushing touchdowns certainly serves its purpose, but we have to be careful because since week 8, the Los Angeles Rams have only been allowing 3.07 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. As long as Rashaad Penny can get himself work in the receiving game, then by all means, he'll be good to go. He will serve as the number 1 running back going forward. First, second, third down, doesn't matter. I think Rashaad Penny is a great play this week as our number 24. Moving on to the RB3 conversation, beginning with Damien Harris. This is where we begin talking about players that we legitimately have no clue whether or not they're going to play. And that is why we have Damien Harris here at number 25, despite a potential better week that he probably end up producing for us against the Indianapolis Colts. He was limited today, but if there's a potential in which he could practice this week in any sort of capacity and play, despite the hamstring strain that he sustained the last time we saw him against the Buffalo Bills prior to the bye week, then by all means, he'll be in a good position. He had a week off. Hopefully, will be healthy and ready to go against this Indianapolis Colts defense. Now, with that all mentioned, my anticipation is most likely him splitting carries with Rhamondre Stevenson. If that's going to be the case, number 25 seems like a perfect spot. If he's going to be at a full capacity and fully practices on Friday, then by all means, it'll be adjusted. He'll be a better play. Moving on, we have Myles Gaskin, another one of these scenarios in which we don't even know if he's going to play. He is currently on the virus IR list, along with all other starting running backs or running backs in general for the Miami Dolphins, Phillip Lindsay, Salvin Ahmed. We don't know who's going to be starting this week, if anybody, at the running back position. Myles Gaskin has found a lot of success as of late. Since week 7, from week 7 through 13, Myles Gaskin touched the ball 15 times every single game. When you're getting 15 plus touches, of course, success is going to be there. And he's been the number 11 overall running back throughout that span of time, week 7 through 13. So, of course, we anticipate Myles Gaskin to be a great play, specifically because he takes on the New York Jets. The New York Jets earlier this season, when he played against them in week 11, he went for 17.1 fantasy points. So why not continue to invest in Myles Gaskin? As long as he's healthy and active, he's a great play. Moving on to Miles Sanders, another one of these running backs that we don't even know if he's playing. Last time we saw him went down with an ankle injury despite having 120 rushing yards on 24 attempts, 15.7 fantasy points. Now the conversation will now be in regards to if he is healthy, by all means he's an automatic start. But if he is not, if he's limited to a capacity and he's getting only 10 to 11 touches against the Washington football team defense, is that going to be enough touches to make him a solidified RB2? I don't think that'll be the case because Boston Scott, Jordan Howard, they'll be healthy, ready to go. Kenneth Gainwell always certainly going to be there. And of course, if you have an active Jalen Hurts, the rushing attempts are also going in his direction as well, 10 times per game. So I think Miles Sanders will be a limited, overall play, and that is why we have him at number 27. Moving on to number 28. I don't know what to do with James Robinson. Back-to-back weeks in which he is nowhere even close to scoring relevant fantasy points. Isn't given any good opportunity. Takes on the Houston Texans that by all means on the ground are giving up the second most points to opposing running backs per week since week 8. It's an incredible matchup, but I don't trust the Jaguars organization. I don't think the Jaguars organization trusts Urban Meyer, and just that in itself, the fact that you have a cancer in your own roster, in the top position of your organization, it is just really going to be a trickle-down system in which everybody's not going to benefit. James Robinson, a couple weeks ago, was benched for no reason, and it is what it is. We're going to have to figure it out. Hopefully James Robinson can have himself a week here, but I don't know if I trust him enough to start him in my fantasy lineup for the fantasy playoffs. Moving on to number 29, we have A.J. Dillon. As long as Aaron Jones is going to be on this roster and taking touchdowns and being a vital part of the receiving game, then by all means, A.J. Dillon is a limited running back play and an RB3. Of course, the fact that he was able to get himself 15 total rushing attempts for 71 yards is incredible. But if he capped off that drive with a touchdown, it would be completely different. I think A.J. Dillon would be a top 24 running back going into this week's matchup because we'd have more confidence even against the Baltimore Ravens. But the fact that he's getting limited touches, not a lot of goal line work, and they play against Baltimore, that is why he serves as a number 29. Moving on to number 30, Chuba Hubbard. Got himself a touchdown, a lucky one at that, because Cam Newton stole the early touchdown in that game. It looks like the quarterback position is going to be a rotational thing for the Carolina Panthers, but nonetheless, they take on the Buffalo Bills. They're giving up the 5th most points to opposing running backs. They have allowed 100 plus rushing yards to an opposing running back in 3 out of the last 4 games. I think there's a very good chance that Chuba Hubbard, if his offensive line is healthy, I know he was missing both offensive guards this last week. If we're in a scenario where they're both ready, Chuba Hubbard could be a great play. Moving on to Craig Reynolds. I don't know who's going to be the starter this week. I don't know if DeAndre Swift's back. I don't know if there's a potential which Jamal Williams is back. But if Craig Reynolds is going to serve as a starter here, then by all means, he has a lot of value. He did look great against the Denver Broncos' tough run-stopping defense and was able to get himself a great amount of opportunity as the Lions have continued to do all season long with their respective running backs. Reynolds, not a bad option at 31. Moving on to Michael Carter, who should be returning from the injured reserve this week, may be limited to a capacity, but the fact that he takes on the Miami Dolphins, literally the toughest matchup at the running back position, and the way that he played against them the last time in week 11, he didn't have himself the greatest game. And I think, Ty Johnson, obviously he ran the second most routes amongst all running backs this last week, will continue to be a vital part of that offense, will certainly limit Michael Carter's potential upside, which is why he sits at 32. Moving on to Devin Singletary. He in fact ran the most routes amongst all running backs this last week and was able to get himself 7 targets, 6 catches, 37 yards, 4 rushing attempts for 52 yards. To be honest, we want to start him, but the unfortunate nature of the beast is that the Buffalo Bills offense is unpredictable. Sometimes Zach Moss is active, sometimes he's not. And it purely depends on game script. And the fact that they take on the Carolina Panthers, who have suffered in terms of stopping the run to opposing running backs as of late, makes me believe that Zach Moss may be active and may be stealing some work from Devin Singletary this week. Just got to be, a little bit careful. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson, of course, he will be digging into the work of Damien Harris as we anticipate. Last time we saw this team, Rhamondre Stevenson ran the ball 24 times and Damien Harris 11. Of course, 11 times until he got hurt and left. Rhamondre Stevenson could be, potentially 10 plus touches this week and get himself a relevant fantasy buzz. Moving on to Chase Edmonds, coming off of the injured reserve, should be active for the Detroit game. If James Conner is not going to play, then by all means, Chase Edmonds is very easily, in my opinion, a top 24 running back. But if in fact we're going to see James Conner active, I think there's a very good possibility in which, of course, still we see Chase Edmonds produce great fantasy points. I mean, again, Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon both scored 2 touchdowns each, both had over 100 all-purpose yards. Chase Edmonds could have himself a great performance here once he's back and ready and healthy against Detroit. Moving on, our final option is Tony Pollard. I know he's dealing with a little bit of a plantar fasciitis issue. As long as he's healthy and active in the Dallas Cowboys lineup, then by all means, he's going to continue to trickle away at Zeke's overall upside and get himself some value, make some big runs that he has proven all season long. Okay, those are our top 36 running back rankings for week 15 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Tomorrow we'll talk about the wide receiver position. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel, support the channel by clicking the like button down below, and check out Underdog Fantasy using promo code Andrew today. Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, link down in the description. Thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate the support. Good luck in your week 15 matchups, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.